"Any work for a meal, sir," she pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper as the mountain wind carried her desperate words across the frozen clearing. Daniel Collins stood motionless in his cabin doorway, his weathered hands gripping the wooden frame as he stared at the figure before him. The woman's outstretched palms told a story more heartbreaking than any words could convey. Raw, bloodied, and trembling from cold and exhaustion, they spoke of desperation so profound it reached into the deepest chambers of his guarded heart. But this moment of reckoning had been building for days, through circumstances that would test the very limits of human endurance and compassion. 3 weeks earlier, when the first heavy snows of winter began to blanket the Colorado Territory, Janet Ramirez had been a different woman entirely. She had possessed a home, a future, and hoped that tomorrow would bring something better than today. The mining camp where she had worked as a seamstress and laundress had been rough but provided enough coin to keep food on her table and a roof over her head. The trouble began when the silver vein that had sustained the camp for 2 years suddenly played out. Within days, the miners packed their belongings and moved on to more promising claims, leaving behind empty buildings and a handful of souls with nowhere else to go. Janet had stayed longer than most, clinging to the possibility that someone might return, that the camp might revive itself as others had done before. She spent her last dollars on supplies, rationing them carefully while she waited for opportunity to present itself. When the food ran out and the cold became unbearable in her unheated shack, Janet finally accepted that she had to leave. She bundled her few possessions into a worn canvas sack and set out on foot toward the nearest settlement, some 30 miles through mountain passes that were already treacherous with ice and snow. The journey that should have taken 2 days stretched into a week as she struggled through drifts that sometimes reached her waist, sleeping in whatever shelter she could find among the rocks and trees. Her boots, already worn thin from months of hard use, began to fall apart on the second day. By the fourth day, she was walking with rags wrapped around her feet, leaving bloody prints in the snow. Her gloves had been lost when she slipped crossing a frozen stream, plunging her hands into the icy water to break her fall. After that, her fingers became increasingly numb and clumsy, making it difficult to gather firewood or even unwrap the meager portions of food that remained in her pack. If you are watching this story unfold, please take a moment to comment where you are watching from and give this video some hype to help others discover these tales of resilience and hope. Now, let us continue with Janet's harrowing journey through the mountains. On the 6th day, with her strength nearly gone and her supplies exhausted, Janet spotted smoke rising from a chimney in the distance. The sight filled her with such relief that tears froze on her cheeks before she could wipe them away. She stumbled toward the source, following a barely visible trail that wound between towering pines heavy with snow. Her feet were so numb she could barely feel them, and her hands had swollen and cracked from the cold until every movement sent sharp pains shooting up her arms. The cabin that emerged from the wilderness seemed like something from a dream. Built of solid logs and chinked against the wind, it sat in a small clearing with smoke curling peacefully from its stone chimney. Firewood was stacked neatly under a covered porch, and she could see warm light glowing through windows that spoke of comfort and safety. For a moment, Janet hesitated at the edge of the clearing, suddenly aware of how she must appear to anyone who might answer her knock. Her dress was torn and stained from the journey, her hair hung in tangled strands beneath a threadbare shawl, and her face was gaunt from hunger and marked by windburn. She looked like exactly what she was, a desperate woman with nothing left to lose. But pride was a luxury she could no longer afford, and the alternative to asking for help was freezing to death in the mountains. She forced her battered feet to carry her across the clearing to the cabin door. Daniel Collins had been living alone in these mountains for nearly 5 years, and in all that time, he had seen perhaps a dozen other human souls. Most were trappers or prospectors passing through, men who understood the unwritten codes of mountain hospitality and wilderness survival. He was accustomed to sharing his fire and his food with travelers, asking few questions and expecting the same courtesy in return. But when he heard the soft, hesitant knock at his door that evening, something in the sound told him this visitor was different. He had been reading by the fire, enjoying the simple pleasure of a warm cabin while the wind howled outside. The knock came again, so faint he almost missed it over the sound of the storm. When he opened the door, the sight that greeted him struck him like a physical blow. The woman standing on his porch was barely upright, swaying with exhaustion and cold. Her clothes were inadequate for the weather, and he could see that her feet were wrapped in bloody rags instead of proper boots. But it was her hands that stopped his breath in his throat. When she raised them in a gesture of supplication, he saw that they were raw and swollen, the skin cracked and bleeding from exposure. They shook not just from cold but from the effort it took to lift them. And in that moment, Daniel Collins felt something shift inside his chest that he had not experienced in years. Here was suffering so profound and immediate that it demanded action, not contemplation. "Any work for a meal, sir," she had said, and the words contained such dignity despite her desperate circumstances that Daniel felt ashamed of his own comfort. He had food enough for a dozen men, a warm fire, and a solid roof, while this woman had walked through hell itself just to reach his door. Without a word, he stepped aside and gestured for her to enter, already moving toward the fire to pull a chair closer to its warmth. Janet stumbled into the cabin, overwhelmed by the sudden warmth and the scent of coffee and stew that filled the air. She had not dared to hope for such kindness, and for a moment she could only stand there, trembling as feeling began to return to her frozen limbs. The pain was excruciating, but it was also proof that she was alive, that she had survived when survival seemed impossible. Daniel moved with quiet efficiency, pulling blankets from his bed and wrapping them around her shoulders before guiding her to the chair by the fire. He did not speak, sensing that words were less important than action in this moment. Instead, he ladled hot stew into a bowl and placed it in her hands, then poured coffee into a tin cup and set it within easy reach. Only when she had begun to eat, slowly and carefully, as if she could not quite believe the food was real, did he allow himself to truly look at her. She was younger than he had first thought, perhaps 25 or 30, with dark hair and eyes that held intelligence despite her exhaustion. There was something in her bearing, even in her current state, that spoke of inner strength and determination. She ate without haste, savoring each spoonful as if it were a precious gift, and when she looked up to meet his eyes, he saw gratitude so profound it was almost painful to witness. "Thank you," she whispered, and the simple words carried more weight than any elaborate speech. Daniel nodded and turned away, busying himself with banking the fire and preparing a sleeping area on the floor near the hearth. He gave her his bed without discussion, knowing that she needed warmth and rest more than he needed comfort. Throughout the night, he listened to her breathing, gradually slow and deepen as sleep finally claimed her exhausted body. In the morning, Janet woke to find her host already up and moving quietly about the cabin. He had prepared breakfast and set out clean clothes that, while too large, were warm and dry. Her own garments hung near the fire, cleaned and mended as best as possible. When she tried to thank him again, he waved away her words with an awkward gesture that suggested he was not accustomed to gratitude. The storm continued for 3 more days, making travel impossible and giving Janet time to recover her strength. Daniel proved to be a man of few words, but many kindnesses. He tended to her frostbitten hands with gentle care, applying salve and changing bandages without comment on the extent of her injuries. He shared his meals without making her feel like a burden, and when she insisted on helping with small tasks around the cabin, he allowed her to contribute without making her feel useless. As her hands began to heal and her strength returned, Janet found herself studying her silent host with growing curiosity. Daniel Collins was a man shaped by solitude and hard work, with calloused hands and a weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone completely at home in the wilderness, and she began to understand that his choice to live alone was deliberate rather than circumstantial. On the 4th morning, the storm finally broke, leaving the world outside transformed by fresh snow that sparkled like diamonds in the sunlight. Janet knew that she could no longer delay her departure, that she had imposed on Daniel's hospitality long enough. But when she began to gather her things, she found herself reluctant to leave this place of safety and unexpected kindness. "I should go," she said, though the words felt heavy on her tongue. "The nearest town is still many miles, and I have taken enough of your time and supplies." Daniel looked up from the harness he was mending, his expression unreadable. "Where will you go?" he asked quietly, and the simple question contained layers of concern that made her throat tighten with emotion. Janet had been avoiding that very question for days, knowing that she had no real answer. The mining camp was dead, she had no family to turn to, and her few dollars would not last long in any town large enough to offer employment. She was essentially homeless, with no prospects and winter closing in around her like a trap. The admission of her circumstances felt like another kind of defeat, but she could not lie to this man who had shown her such unexpected compassion. "I do not know," she answered honestly, and saw something shift in Daniel's expression. He set down the harness and looked at her directly, his gray eyes serious and thoughtful. The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities and the weight of decisions that could change both their lives forever. "You could stay," he said finally, the words coming out rough and uncertain. "I mean, if you wanted to. There is plenty of work here, and winter is no time for traveling alone." The offer hung in the air between them, simple and profound in its implications. Janet stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "Stay here," she repeated, as if testing the words for hidden meanings. "With you?" It was not a question but a statement that acknowledged the magnitude of what he was suggesting. Two strangers, thrown together by circumstance, considering a partnership that defied all conventional wisdom about proper behavior and social expectations. Daniel nodded, his face flushing slightly as he realized how his offer might be interpreted. "I have a spare room," he said quickly. "It would be proper. I just meant that you could help with the cooking and mending, and I could teach you about surviving up here. It would be a fair exchange." Nothing more. His earnestness was so apparent that Janet felt a smile tug at the corners of her mouth, despite everything she had been through. The idea of staying in this peaceful cabin, of having a roof over her head and meaningful work to do, was more appealing than anything she had dared to imagine. But she also understood the risks involved for both of them. Mountain communities were small and gossip traveled fast, even in the wilderness. A single woman living with a bachelor, even in the most innocent circumstances, would be the subject of speculation and judgment. "What would people say?" she asked, voicing the concern that she knew they both shared. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, considering her question with the same careful attention he gave to all important matters. Then he shrugged, a gesture that somehow conveyed both resignation and defiance. "People will say what they choose to say regardless of the truth," he replied. "The question is whether we let their opinions dictate how we live our lives. I know what kind of man I am, and I believe I know what kind of woman you are. That should be enough." His words carried a simple wisdom that cut through all the complicated social conventions that had governed Janet's life up to this point. She thought of the mining camp, where she had lived under constant scrutiny and judgment, where every action was weighed against impossible standards of feminine propriety. She thought of the long, cold journey through the mountains and the desperation that had driven her to knock on a stranger's door. Most of all, she thought of the kindness this man had shown her, asking nothing in return except the opportunity to help another human being in need. "I would like to stay," she said quietly, and felt something inside her chest loosen and expand, like a flower opening to sunlight. Daniel's face broke into a smile that transformed his weathered features, revealing the gentle soul that lived beneath his rugged exterior. It was the beginning of a partnership that would challenge both of them in ways they could not yet imagine. The first few weeks of their arrangement were marked by careful politeness and mutual respect. Janet threw herself into the domestic tasks that had been neglected during Daniel's years of bachelor living, mending clothes and curtains, organizing supplies, and preparing meals that were more elaborate than the simple fare he had grown accustomed to. Daniel, in turn, began teaching her the skills she would need to survive in the mountains, showing her how to read weather signs, preserve food, and maintain the equipment that kept their small world functioning. They developed routines that allowed them to share the limited space of the cabin without awkwardness, each respecting the other's need for privacy and quiet reflection. Janet claimed the small back room as her own, hanging a curtain across the doorway and arranging her few possessions with care. Daniel continued to sleep by the fire, claiming he preferred it to the confines of a closed room, though Janet suspected his choice was motivated more by consideration than preference. As the days grew shorter and the snow piled deeper around their cabin, Janet found herself settling into a rhythm of life she had never experienced before. There was a peace in the mountain solitude that she had not expected, a sense of being connected to something larger and more enduring than the petty concerns that had dominated her previous existence. She began to understand why Daniel had chosen this isolated life and why he seemed so content with his own company. But she also began to see the loneliness that he tried to hide, the way his face would light up when she entered a room, or how he would linger over their evening conversations by the fire. He was a man who had convinced himself that solitude was preferable to the complications of human relationships, but Janet's presence was slowly revealing the cost of that choice. She found herself looking forward to their talks as much as he did, treasuring the moments when his careful reserve would drop and she would catch glimpses of his thoughts and dreams. The first real test of their partnership came in late December, when a series of storms trapped them in the cabin for nearly 2 weeks. The wind howled constantly, piling snow against the windows until they had to dig their way out to reach the woodpile. Supplies ran low despite Daniel's careful preparations, and they were forced to ration their food while waiting for the weather to break. During those long, confined days, Janet learned more about Daniel Collins than she had in all the weeks since her arrival. He told her about his life before the mountains, about the farm in Missouri where he had grown up and the war that had changed everything. He spoke of battles and losses, of friends who had not come home, and of the difficulty he had faced in trying to return to a normal life when the fighting ended. The mountains had offered him peace and purpose when civilization had failed to provide either, he explained one evening as they sat by the dying fire. Up here, a man's worth is measured by his actions, not his connections or his past. The land does not care about politics or social standing. It only cares whether you are strong enough and smart enough to survive. His words helped Janet understand why he had been so willing to take her in, why he had looked past her desperate circumstances to see the person beneath. In return, Janet found herself sharing her own story, speaking of dreams deferred and opportunities lost, of the constant struggle to maintain dignity in circumstances that seemed designed to strip it away. She told him about the mining camp and the men who had treated her with casual disrespect, about the loneliness of being a single woman in a world that offered few acceptable choices for independence. "We are both refugees, in our own way," she said one night as they listened to the wind rattling the shutters. "You from a world that no longer made sense to you, and me from a world that never offered me a real place in it. Perhaps that is why we understand each other so well." Daniel nodded, recognizing the truth in her observation and feeling grateful for the first time in years that he was not facing the winter alone. When the storms finally passed and they were able to venture outside again, Janet was amazed by the transformation that had taken place. The world had been sculpted into new shapes by wind and snow, creating a landscape of breathtaking beauty that seemed to exist outside of ordinary time. She stood in the doorway of the cabin, breathing the crisp, clean air, and feeling a sense of belonging that she had never experienced before. "This is home," she realized with sudden clarity, and the thought filled her with both joy and trepidation. She had not intended to become so attached to this place and this man, but somewhere during the long winter nights, her temporary refuge had become something much more significant. The question now was whether Daniel felt the same way, and whether they could build something lasting from the fragile foundation of mutual need and growing affection. Spring came late to the mountains that year, arriving in fits and starts with warm days, followed by unexpected snowfalls that reminded them winter was not yet ready to relinquish its hold. But gradually, the world began to wake up around their cabin, with streams running full and clear, wildflowers pushing through the melting snow, and birds returning to fill the air with song. Janet had been with Daniel for nearly 6 months when the first visitors appeared at their door. 2 trappers, heading north to check their lines, stopped to share news and trade for supplies. Their presence broke the spell of isolation that had surrounded the cabin all winter, bringing with it reminders of the larger world and the judgments it might pass on their unconventional arrangement. The men were polite enough, but Janet could see the questions in their eyes as they looked from her to Daniel and back again. They spoke carefully, avoiding direct inquiries about her presence, while clearly wondering about the nature of their relationship. When they left the next morning, Janet knew that word of her residence would spread through the scattered mountain communities, creating speculation and gossip that could affect both their reputations. Daniel seemed unconcerned by the potential consequences, maintaining his usual calm demeanor as he went about his daily tasks. But Janet found herself increasingly troubled by the implications of their situation. She had been grateful for his protection and kindness during the worst of winter, but now that survival was no longer the primary concern, she began to question whether she was being fair to him by staying. A respectable man like Daniel deserves better than to have his name connected with scandal, she thought as she worked in the small garden they had planted behind the cabin. He had saved her life, and asked nothing in return except companionship and help with domestic tasks. The least she could do was protect him from the social consequences of his generosity. But when she tried to raise the subject with Daniel, he dismissed her concerns with characteristic directness. "I told you before that people will talk regardless of what we do," he said as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. "The only opinions that matter are our own, and I know we have nothing to be ashamed of." His words were meant to be reassuring, but they only highlighted the complexity of Janet's feelings. She was no longer the desperate woman who had stumbled to his door, seeking only shelter and food. Over the months, she had come to care for Daniel Collins in ways that went far beyond gratitude, and she suspected that her feelings were not entirely one-sided. The careful distance they had maintained was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain, and she knew that something would have to change soon. The crisis came in early summer, when a group of men arrived at the cabin with news that changed everything. They were representatives from a mining consortium that had purchased claims throughout the region, and they carried legal documents that gave them the right to survey and develop Daniel's land. The mountain that had been his refuge for 5 years was sitting on top of a significant copper deposit, and the company was prepared to pay handsomely for the rights to extract it. Daniel listened to their offer in stony silence, his face revealing nothing of his thoughts as they described the wealth that could be his if he agreed to sell. They spoke of enough money to buy a fine house in Denver or San Francisco, of investments that could provide comfort for the rest of his life. All he had to do was sign the papers and walk away from the cabin he had built with his own hands. When the men finally left, promising to return in a week for his answer, Daniel sat on the porch, staring at the mountains as if seeing them for the first time. Janet joined him in the gathering dusk, sensing the turmoil beneath his calm exterior and wishing she could offer some guidance that might help him make such a momentous decision. "They want to tear it all down," he said finally, his voice heavy with something that might have been grief. "Every tree, every stream, every peaceful corner, where a man can think his own thoughts. They will turn it into a scar on the earth, and when they are finished taking what they want, they will move on and leave nothing but poison and emptiness behind." Janet understood that he was not just talking about the land, but about a way of life that was rapidly disappearing as civilization pushed deeper into the wilderness. The mining consortium represented everything he had tried to escape when he came to the mountains, the relentless pursuit of profit at the expense of anything that could not be bought or sold. But she also understood that he could not fight progress indefinitely, that the world was changing whether he liked it or not. The question was whether he would adapt to those changes or be crushed by them, and what role she might play in whatever decision he made. "You could take the money and find another place," she suggested gently, knowing even as she spoke that it was not really a solution. "There are other mountains, other places where a man can live in peace." But Daniel shook his head, his expression sad but resolute. "This is not just about finding solitude," he replied. "This land has been my home, my sanctuary, my reason for believing that there is still some good left in the world. I cannot simply pack up and start over somewhere else, pretending that none of this mattered. If I leave, it should be because I have found something worth leaving for. Not because I was driven away by men who see nothing but dollar signs when they look at God's creation." His words hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither of them was quite ready to address directly. Janet felt her heart racing as she considered the possibility that he might be talking about more than just the land, that his decision might somehow involve her and the feelings that had been growing between them all winter. The next few days passed in a strange suspension of normal activity, as if they were both waiting for some external force to resolve the dilemma for them. Daniel went through the motions of his daily routine, but Janet could see that his mind was elsewhere, wrestling with choices that would affect not just his future, but hers as well. She found herself watching him with new intensity, memorizing the way he moved and spoke and smiled, as if she might soon lose the opportunity to do so. On the morning before the mining representatives were scheduled to return, Janet made a decision that surprised even her. She had been thinking about her own future, about what would happen to her if Daniel chose to sell the land and move on. She had no legal claim to stay, no resources to establish herself elsewhere, and no family to turn to for support. But more than that, she had realized that the question of where she would go was less important than the question of whether she would be with the man she had come to love. "Daniel," she said as they shared their morning coffee, "there is something I need to tell you before those men come back." He looked up from his cup, his gray eyes serious and attentive in the way that had first made her feel truly heard and understood. "I know that my presence here has complicated your life in ways you never intended, and I know that people are beginning to talk about us in ways that could damage your reputation." She paused, gathering courage for what she needed to say next. "But I also know that I care for you more than I have ever cared for anyone, and I believe that you might feel the same way about me. If that is true, then perhaps we should stop worrying about what other people think and start considering what we want for ourselves." Daniel set down his coffee cup with hands that were not quite steady, his face reflecting a mixture of hope and uncertainty that made Janet's heart ache with tenderness. He had been so careful to maintain proper boundaries between them, so determined to protect her reputation and his own, that he had never allowed himself to openly acknowledge what had been building between them for months. "Janet," he said quietly, "you must know that my feelings for you go far beyond gratitude or simple companionship. You have brought light and warmth into a life that I had convinced myself was complete in its solitude. But I am not a young man, and I have little to offer except a hard life in a place that most people would consider the middle of nowhere." She reached across the small table and took his weathered hand in both of hers, feeling the calluses and scars that told the story of his years in the wilderness. Those hands had built their cabin, had tended her injuries, had worked tirelessly to provide for both of them through the long winter. They were beautiful to her in ways that had nothing to do with conventional standards of attractiveness. "You have already given me more than any other person ever has," she replied, her voice steady despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. "You gave me shelter when I had nowhere to go, kindness when I expected only indifference, and respect when the world had taught me to expect much less. If you are willing to have me, not as a temporary guest but as a true partner, then I cannot imagine anywhere else I would rather be." Daniel's face transformed as her words sank in, years of careful emotional control giving way to an expression of pure joy that made him look like a much younger man. He lifted her hands to his lips and kissed them gently, mindful of the faint scars that remained from her terrible journey through the mountains. Those marks had become precious to him, symbols of her courage and determination, reminders of the miraculous chance that had brought her to his door. "Then marry me," he said simply, and the words seemed to echo in the small cabin like a benediction. "Marry me, and we will face whatever comes together, whether it is mining companies or gossips or the simple challenges of building a life in this beautiful, difficult place. I cannot promise you luxury or ease, but I can promise you love and partnership and a home where you will always be welcome." Janet felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she nodded her acceptance, overwhelmed by the rightness of the moment and the man who had seen past her desperate circumstances to the woman beneath. They held each other in the morning light that streamed through their windows, two people who had found in each other something they had not even known they were searching for. When the mining representatives returned that afternoon, they found a very different Daniel Collins than the one they had left a week earlier. He met them at the door with Janet beside him, her hand resting confidently on his arm, and informed them that he would not be selling his land at any price. "This place is my home," he said with quiet finality, "and I intend to stay here with my wife for as long as God grants us life." The men tried to argue, increasing their offer and warning about the consequences of standing in the way of progress, but Daniel remained unmoved. He had found something more valuable than all the copper in the mountains, something that no amount of money could purchase or replace. When they finally left, muttering about legal challenges and eminent domain, he felt only relief that the decision had been made. The wedding took place 3 weeks later, in the small church in the nearest settlement, with half a dozen witnesses who had made the journey to see the mountain hermit marry the mysterious woman who had appeared in their midst like something from a fairy tale. Janet wore a simple dress that she had sewn herself from fabric Daniel had purchased during a rare trip to town, and Daniel had trimmed his beard and slicked back his hair in an effort to look respectable for the occasion. The ceremony was brief and practical, conducted by a circuit preacher who asked few questions and seemed genuinely pleased to be joining two people who were so obviously devoted to each other. When Daniel slipped a plain gold band onto Janet's finger, she felt a sense of completion that she had never expected to experience. She was no longer a woman alone in the world, dependent on the charity of others for survival. She was a wife, a partner, a person with a place and a purpose that no one could take away from her. The journey back to their cabin was filled with quiet conversation and shared glances, both of them still adjusting to the reality of their new status. They had been living as partners for months, but the formal recognition of their union felt significant in ways that surprised them both. There was a sense of permanence now, a commitment that went beyond the practical arrangements that had brought them together. That evening, as they sat by the fire that had witnessed so many of their conversations, Janet reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had led to this moment. If the mining camp had not failed, if the storms had not been so severe, if she had chosen a different path through the mountains, she might never have found the man who had become the center of her world. It seemed impossible that so much happiness could have grown from such desperate circumstances. Daniel was thinking similar thoughts as he watched his wife, still marveling at the word and all it represented. The woman who had appeared at his door like an answer to prayers he had not known he was praying had transformed his life in ways he was still discovering. The cabin that had once been a refuge from the world had become a home in the truest sense, a place where love could flourish despite the challenges that surrounded them. The mining company did not give up easily, sending lawyers and surveyors and finally offering sums that would have made Daniel wealthy beyond his wildest dreams. But he and Janet faced each challenge together, presenting a united front that gradually wore down their opponent's determination. The legal battles dragged on for months, but eventually, the company found easier targets elsewhere and left them in peace. During those difficult times, Janet proved to be a formidable ally, her intelligence and determination complementing Daniel's stubborn refusal to be intimidated. She researched property laws and mining regulations, wrote letters to government officials, and even traveled to Denver to consult with lawyers who specialized in land rights. The desperate woman who had begged for work in exchange for a meal had become a fierce defender of the home she had helped to create. As their first year of marriage drew to a close, Janet found herself pregnant with their first child. The news filled them both with a joy that seemed almost too profound to be real. The promise of new life, adding another layer of meaning to their mountain sanctuary. They spent the long winter evenings planning for the future, talking about the kind of life they wanted to provide for their children and the values they hoped to pass on. The baby arrived in early spring. A healthy son, they named Thomas, after Daniel's father, who had taught him the importance of hard work and integrity. Janet proved to be a natural mother, caring for the infant with the same fierce devotion she had shown in defending their land. Daniel, who had never imagined himself as a father, discovered reserves of tenderness and protectiveness that surprised him with their intensity. As Thomas grew from infant to toddler, the cabin rang with sounds it had never known before, laughter and crying, and the endless chatter of a child discovering the world around him. Janet and Daniel took turns teaching him about the mountains, showing him how to identify animal tracks and bird calls, how to read the weather and respect the power of the wilderness that surrounded their home. Other children followed, two daughters who inherited their mother's quick intelligence and their father's steady determination. The cabin was expanded to accommodate the growing family, with additional rooms and a larger kitchen where Janet could prepare meals for her expanding brood. Daniel built furniture and toys with his own hands, taking pride in providing for his family through his skill and labor rather than purchased goods. The years passed with the rhythm of seasons and the milestones of family life. Thomas learned to hunt and fish alongside his father, while his sisters helped their mother with the garden and household tasks that kept their mountain home functioning. They were largely self-sufficient, producing most of what they needed and trading occasionally with neighbors for items they could not make themselves. The mining company's threats became a distant memory as other concerns took precedence. There were droughts to weather and harsh winters to survive, illnesses to nurse and accidents to overcome. Through it all, Janet and Daniel faced each challenge as partners, their love deepening with each shared trial and triumph. When visitors came to their mountain home, they often remarked on the contentment that seemed to radiate from the Collins family. Here were people who had found something that many spent their entire lives searching for, a sense of purpose and belonging that transcended material wealth or social status. They had built their happiness on a foundation of mutual respect and shared values, creating a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. Janet sometimes thought back to that desperate winter night when she had knocked on Daniel's door, remembering the woman she had been and marveling at the transformation that had taken place. She had been seeking nothing more than survival, a meal and shelter to get her through another day. Instead, she had found a home, a family, and a love that had exceeded her wildest dreams. Daniel, too, reflected on the miraculous nature of their meeting, understanding now that his years of solitude had been preparation for the moment when he would be called upon to open his heart to another person. The woman who had appeared at his door with bloodied hands and desperate eyes had brought him gifts he had not known he was missing, filling his life with purpose and joy that made every day a celebration. On quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the mountain air was filled with the sounds of night creatures going about their business, Janet and Daniel would sit together on their porch and talk about the journey that had brought them to this place of peace and contentment. They spoke of dreams fulfilled and challenges overcome, of the unexpected ways that love could transform even the most desperate circumstances into something beautiful and lasting. The mining company had long since moved on to other ventures, their threats and promises forgotten in the face of more immediate concerns. The mountains remained unchanged, offering their timeless beauty and harsh lessons to anyone brave enough to call them home. And in their small cabin, surrounded by the family they had created together, Janet and Daniel Collins continued to live proof that sometimes the most profound happiness can grow from the most unlikely beginnings. The story of their meeting had become legend in the scattered communities of the high country, told and retold around campfires and kitchen tables as an example of how kindness and courage could triumph over desperation and despair. People spoke of the woman who had walked through hell itself to find love, and the man who had seen past her desperate circumstances to the treasure that lay beneath. But for Janet and Daniel, their story was not a legend, but a living reality, renewed each day through small acts of love and devotion that kept their partnership strong. They had learned that true wealth could not be measured in gold or silver, but in the bonds that connected one human heart to another. They had discovered that home was not a place, but a feeling, created wherever two people chose to build a life together based on mutual respect and shared dreams. As they grew older and their children began families of their own, Janet and Daniel remained devoted partners, their love deepened by decades of shared experience and mutual support. They had weathered storms, both literal and metaphorical, faced challenges that had tested their resolve and their commitment to each other. Through it all, they had remained true to the promise they had made on that long-ago morning when desperation had given way to hope, and two lonely souls had found in each other the completion they had been seeking all their lives. The mountain man who had opened his door to a desperate stranger had indeed given her his heart, just as she had given him hers in return. And in that exchange, both had found riches beyond anything the mining companies could have offered, treasures that would endure long after the last copper had been torn from the earth, and the scars of progress had been reclaimed by the eternal wilderness they called home.